Resident Evil has a lot of story threads that often take place in the background, told through files, supplemental material, and, if you're lucky, the occasional flashback. One of these is the backstory behind Albert Wesker, the caramel-voiced former captain of STARS team turned megalomaniac. But how did Wesker come into being? How did he become Resident Evil's Neo? Well, for that we need to go right back to the start. This is Steve from First Aid Spray, and this is the Wesker Program. This video, like previous and future lore-focused videos, wouldn't have been possible without the hard work of the Resident Evil community. In this case, the Resident Evil podcast and The Batman's incredible Resident Evil mythology timeline. Check it out if you haven't. Now, on with the show. This storyline thread, like a lot of things in the Resident Evil universe, starts with the twisted machinations of Oswell E. Spencer, one of Umbrella's founders. Spencer's story truly begins with his obsession with the fabled Stairway to the Sun, a sacred African flower said to be the key to not only superhuman abilities, but also potentially eternal life, according to the writings of 19th century explorer Henry Travis. Spencer had always fantasized about creating the next step in human evolution, men and women free of disease, rid of the perils of aging, and for all intents and purposes, immortal. And he had a rather deranged addendum to this, with a desire of ruling over the next step of human evolution as its god. Basically, dude's a nut job.
You will never see your loved ones again.
By ploughing his money and the money of his rich friends into expeditions in Africa, Spencer would eventually secure the flower and the RNA retrovirus within it that was the source of the fauna's mystical abilities. To Spencer, the progenitor virus represented a chance to fulfill his fantasy of forcefully engineering the next evolution of human life. After the construction of the Spencer estate in July 1967, Spencer broke off from his colleagues, Edward Ashford and James Marcus respectively, in order to work on the corporation that would hide and fund their collective work under the banner of pharmaceutical research. However, it was from here that he would begin to make actual efforts to see his dream become a reality. Unfortunately for him, the act of eugenics, specific breeding and indoctrination to produce favourable traits in people, was pretty sketchy at the time since it was heavily associated with Nazi Germany, which had collapsed 2 years prior. Fortunately for Oswell, there was one man who was committed to the same ideas as he, and Spencer proudly named the entire project after him, Dr. Wesker. The first step of the process was to locate ideal specimens. The two scoured the earth for the children of the best and brightest, coming up with a short list of hundreds of potential candidates. Perhaps by using the dark criminal underworld and his incredible wealth, Spencer made sure these children were covertly ripped from their homes and delivered to him in America to be immediately placed into his own specific brand of re-education classes. The idea here being to teach these children to look up and swear allegiance to Oswell E. Spencer, as well as to take on board his beliefs as their own. As they grew older, they were encouraged to hone their bodies and minds, and were given grants to pursue educational fields of their choice. Two particular Wesker Program candidates stood out among the rest. The first was Albert, who upon graduating went to work at the Umbrella training facility under James Marcus. He was an exceptional researcher and demonstrated his loyalty to Spencer when, upon request, he successfully assassinated Marcus. From here, he would go to work in the Arclay laboratory. The other was Alex, who displayed such tenacity early on that it would single her out in totally unique ways. Unfortunately, so did an illness that began to ravage her body at a young age. In order to not waste her potential, Spencer broke some of the cardinal rules of the project and, unlike the others, she had the Wesker Program explained to her in detail. Still devoting herself to Spencer, she was placed on the outside of the project, monitoring her so-called siblings and reporting to her superiors. She was given a second fake surname to disassociate herself from them and, when stationed at Arclay, began a professional rivalry with her would-be brother Albert, not that he was aware of the connection. The next step of the Wesker Program was to use the progenitor research to take these physically and mentally gifted men and women to another level entirely. It was Spencer's hope that he could use progenitor to facilitate faster evolution and growth within specimens to begin the next step in human progress. But it had proven too powerful and viciously killed everyone it came into contact with. That is why, in the ensuing decade since the three scientists had discovered progenitor, Spencer had pursued what was now known as the T-virus, a version of this discovery that his children could not only survive, but adapt to. By the time of 1998, there were many variant strains of the T-virus that had been worked on to differing degrees of success. It was Marcus's catalogue of experiments with leeches that provided Spencer with the virus that he would administer to his Wesker children. The so-called experimental virus was given to 13 of the most promising candidates. Even after all these years of work, 11 of these could not fight against the power of the strain and perished. Only Albert and Alex survived. Whilst this was the case, the virus had no effect on Alex's genetics. Nonetheless, it was amazing enough that she had even survived the experience, especially in her still declining health. Albert, however, saw massive changes to his body when he was killed in July of 1998 at the hands of the T-002 Tyrant. The virus in his body activated, not only reviving him, but gifting him with accelerated healing and heightened physical ability. However, with the destruction of the mansion and the Arclay labs, Albert was presumed dead, and soon after Alex documented in a report that the success rate of the project was down to a measly 18%. With this being the case, Spencer changed tactics. He was aging and becoming weak, and the only way to see his vision of a new world with him as the ruler was to beat mortality itself. He selected Alex to lead a project to keep him alive, supplying her with all the research information he could. However, Alex began to have doubts about her former master and realized that she owed him no favors. In fact, she would be better off using this data to overcome her own ailing health. The subjugation that Spencer and Dr. Wesker had instilled upon her was broken, and in fact had been since the day Oswell had told Alex the truth of her upbringing. From here, she broke loose and, when Spencer was pronounced dead, no longer had to lie or hide the fact that at this point she was working only for herself. In the meantime, Albert's abilities had only grown, as had his megalomania. He began to think of himself as chosen by God, and whilst he worked underground, he continued to have a growing anxiety about his former master. The curiosity that had been instilled in the Wesker children about their supreme leader would make them constantly muse about him, his whereabouts, and his goals, and eventually would lead Wesker back to Spencer in his European estate. However, when Spencer explained this trait to his experiment, like with Alex, the spell was now broken. Wesker saw Spencer for who he was, an arrogant, egotistic, desperate old man, and without mercy took the life of his former father figure. Following this, he also took the man's goals forward, looking to enact an extinction level event and let the strongest survive, with him atop it all. However, the experimental virus in his body was making him weak, and he had to be routinely injected with a progenitor-based compound called PG67A/W. After being forced to overdose on this, Wesker was eventually brought down by Chevre Alomar and longtime rival Chris Redfield. It's hard to classify the Wesker program as a success. Admittedly, Albert Wesker gains near supernatural abilities and near immortality, but at the end of it all, he had to rely on another compound to maintain his strength. Perhaps it seems that the experimental virus was still too much for him over time. Nonetheless, Spencer never got what he wanted either, and so far in that way the project could still be deemed a failure. What do you think? Was the Wesker program a success? What other pieces of lore would you like us to highlight on this channel? Subscribe to stay up to date with everything we do. I've been Steve from First Aid Spray. Be excellent to each other, and I'll catch you in the next video. Bye!